If you're familiar with online pop culture discourse, chances are you've at least heard of Gamergate. It was a conflict which arguably changed the way the internet discussed politics forever, and depending on who you asked, was either about ethics in gaming journalism or a harassment campaign against women in gaming. While many people remember Gamergate and its impact, fewer are aware of its admittedly smaller but still notable successor, Comicsgate. Many of the events have been either poorly documented or lost to time, but I have done my best to piece it all together. This is the insane story of the changing cultural landscape of comics, and the men who tried to create their own legacy by toppling what they thought to be an evil empire. But before we go any further in today's video, I want to give a big shout out to today's sponsor, Raycon. If you're looking for a holiday gift, I've been using Raycon's Everyday Earbuds Classics, and honestly, they're so good. I love that I can play my music and block out everything around me. It's perfect for the gym or when you're out walking. And right now, they're up to 20% off for the holidays, so definitely grab them while you can. Their new model has active noise cancellation, multi-point connectivity so you can pair with 2 devices at once, and a super comfortable ergonomic design that stays put no matter what you're doing. On top of this, they come in a bunch of different colors. And here's the kicker, Raycon delivers the same premium audio quality as the big brands, but at half the price. Add in over 3 million happy customers and a 30-day happiness guarantee, and there's zero reason to overpay. So to try them out for yourself, click the link in the description box down below or go to buyraycon.com/GamerFromMars to get up to 20% off site-wide during this holiday season. Again, go to buyraycon.com/GamerFromMars to get 20% off during this holiday season, or just click the link in the description down below. In order to fully understand why Comicsgate began in the first place, it's important to establish what the comic book industry looked like during the mid-2010s. It wasn't simply one event that caused an enormous amount of backlash, but rather a number of smaller occurrences that compiled over time. While it's debatable when exactly the first domino fell, most people will point to January 4th, 2011. This was the day that Axel Alonso was named the new editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, after his predecessor, Joe Quesada, stepped down following an 11-year tenure. Quesada's reign had been tumultuous to say the least, as he led the publishing giant forward into massively successful new initiatives, while also overseeing some of the most controversial creative decisions in the company's history. One thing that Marvel had struggled with for years was that, outside of a plethora of supporting characters, the protagonists of their stories did not reflect the diversity seen in both the talent working on them or the people reading them. And this was a problem Alonso seemed determined to tackle. In an interview conducted shortly after his promotion, he stated, "It goes without saying that we're interested in having voices represented from across the spectrum. We certainly have more female writers than we've had in the past, but the key thing is these people need to emerge. We need to believe in them, and we need to be able to sell them. I finally got my Mexican superheroes a few years ago, and that felt good. But it has to come organically. It's not something you can force." The push for new culturally diverse characters began soon into his reign. Just a few months later, on September 14th, 2011, Ultimate Comics Spider-Man #1 was published. This introduced the new character Miles Morales, a half-black, half-Latino teen, who would take on the mantle as the next web-slinging superhero following the death of the Ultimate Universe's Peter Parker. Miles was the creation of writer Brian Michael Bendis, who had been scripting the Ultimate Spider-Man series since the year 2000. For a bit of added context, the Ultimate line were set in an alternate universe outside of the mainline Marvel continuity, and were intended to be modernizations of the publisher's classic characters. To that end, Bendis claimed that the creation of Miles was an effort to reflect the vast diversity of both New York City and the readership of Spider-Man. Recently, a good friend of mine who is African American turned to me when I was nervous about the announcement of the new Spider-Man and said, "When I was a kid, they wouldn't let me be Superman or Batman, but they would let me be Spider-Man." Even though this was long before the birth of Comicsgate, there was of course some pushback to the latest iteration of the wall crawler. Conservative radio personality Glenn Beck went on his show to mock the new character, with a very odd conspiracy theory as to who may be responsible for the storyline.
The new Spider-Man is really quite great. He looks just like President Obama. It's fantastic. We now have a half black, half Hispanic gay Spider-Man. Okay.
It's unclear where exactly Beck got the idea that Miles was intended to be gay. When asked in interviews if the character would have any love interests, Bendis stated that since he was just 13 years of age, romance would not be a heavy focus on his story outside of the potential awkward crushes. And as Morales grew older in the years that followed, he has never been shown to be anything other than heterosexual. Regardless of these criticisms, Miles received a generally favorable response from readers, with his debut issue actually outselling the mainline Amazing Spider-Man book during the month it was released. It should be noted that comic book issues which introduce new characters tend to see a spike in sales, and the numbers dipped substantially in October once the initial hype had died down. Also, just to nip a potential criticism in the bud, I'm aware that these sales figures really only reflect the amount of copies of a book that retailers ordered and don't necessarily translate to how well they sold. Our next stop on our journey of comic book diversity happened on July 11th, 2012, when Carol Danvers made her debut as the new Captain Marvel in Avenging Spider-Man number 9, before the start of her own self-titled series a week later. Danvers had been a supporting character for prior versions of Captain Marvel since 1968, and had already been a superhero headlining her own book as Miss Marvel beginning in 1977. According to writer Kelly Sue DeConnick, it had been the intention of editors for Carol Danvers to take on the mantle of Captain Marvel for years, long before she began writing the character. Both because it seemed like a natural progression, but also because Marvel had been trying to publish a wider range of female-led superhero comics. To quote DeConnick, "As an industry, we have to make more female-led books that are actually worth buying. Never mind the Bechdel test, try this. If you can replace your female character with a sexy lamp and the story still basically works, maybe you need another draft. They have to be protagonists, not devices." Kelly Sue's first issue of Captain Marvel hardly set the world on fire, coming in the 42nd place in the overall sales chart the month that it was released. That being said, Captain Marvel had never been an especially popular title, and over time the Carol Danvers iteration received a die-hard fan base that dubbed themselves the Carol Corps. While these two examples certainly set the groundwork for what would eventually become Comicsgate, they were isolated enough not to cause too much of a stir. Miles Morales existed in an alternate universe, and thus did not interfere with the continued adventures of Peter Parker in the main continuity. And Carol Danvers was just the latest in a long line of heroes to use the name Captain Marvel. She wasn't even the first woman to do so. It wasn't until 2014 that things really began to heat up and more people took notice of the increased push for diversity at Marvel Comics. The next part of this tale started in February of that year, when Miss Marvel number 1 introduced the world to Kamala Khan, the publisher's first ever Muslim superhero to headline their own title. While Miles and Carol had both been relatively popular new additions to the lore, Kamala was a smash hit. It didn't simply have to do with her cultural identity. The character was depicted as a die-hard fan of superheroes, particularly the latest iteration of Captain Marvel, and thus struck a chord with the newfound reader base that had been growing ever since the birth of the Carol Corps. The first issue of this new Miss Marvel series sold so astronomically well, in fact, that it went into 7 printings, something practically unheard of in this day and age. But of course, it didn't come without some criticism. Part of it came from the section of the audience that simply didn't enjoy seeing a Muslim character get such a spotlight. But there was another group who objected to the person bringing her to life. G. Willow Wilson, the writer of this new series and the creator of Kamala Khan, was herself a Muslim. However, she had not been born into the faith. Rather, she had been raised an atheist, and didn't convert to Islam until adulthood. There were some woke readers who believed that a white woman with such a background shouldn't be writing about the experiences of a brown-skinned teenager, growing up with the strict expectations of Muslim parents. It's worth noting that this was a small minority, but it was a conversation that swirled around Marvel's newest superhero character regardless. Up until now, we've discussed members of the new generation of diverse characters that went over relatively well with comic reading audiences. Even people who weren't fans of these new characters could at least ignore them, since they didn't step on the toes of Marvel's already long-established costumed crime fighters. But then came a day unlike any other, when Earth's mightiest heroes started to fall and be replaced by a sea of new faces. It happened on October 1st, 2014, the publication date of two incredibly impactful comics, Captain America number 25 and Thor number 1. The former featured a story in which Steve Rogers, the original Cap, was rapidly aged to the point where he was no longer able to be an active superhero. The plot concluded with Sam Wilson, who for decades had fought by Steve's side under the alias of the Falcon, taking up his partner's mantle. I probably don't even need to specify why this sparked debate. Changing the race of an established character is one thing, but it was heavily symbolic and divisive for some to dress up a black man in the famous red, white, and blue uniform. That was the idea, of course, and there was just as much fanfare as there was dissent. Supporters applauded the fact that Captain America now represented a different part of the United States population. Ultimately, while this sparked a lot of outrage, most people were at the very least able to understand why it was made. Superhero mantles being passed down to new characters was hardly a new occurrence, and if Steve Rogers was going to step down from the role, it made logical sense that he'd hand it off to his loyal sidekick. The same cannot be said for the other change Marvel Comics made the same day, which quickly eclipsed the conversation. What needs to be understood is that in the pages of the Thor comics prior to October 1st, the titular character had recently gone through a story arc in which he was deemed no longer worthy of wielding his magic hammer. After that happened, the Thor series was then rebooted back to issue number 1. The ending of which saw an unidentified female character lifting the hammer and gaining the power and title of the God of Thunder. While her identity was kept a mystery at the beginning, she was later revealed to be Jane Foster, an old on-again, off-again love interest for Thor. This caused a massive rift online as comic fans began arguing about this monumentous change, mainly in regards to if it made sense within Marvel Comics lore. Those in favor claimed that this was perfectly in line with what writer Jason Aaron had been doing with the Thor series up until that point, exploring the themes of worthiness and godhood and what exactly they meant. On top of that, they made the point that Jane Foster was far from the first new character deemed worthy of lifting the hammer. But those against it countered by saying the problem didn't come from the fact that she wielded the weapon, but the name she was now using. As Jason Aaron flatly stated in the official press release, "This is not She-Thor. This is not Lady Thor. This is not Thorita. This is Thor. This is the Thor of the Marvel Universe." There was a lot of debate about whether Thor was a title that could be passed down or simply the name of the character. Regardless, Marvel stuck to their guns and maintained that Jane Foster was indeed Thor, while the original now went by the name Odinson. And this could have been the beginning and end of this particular controversy. Up until this point, we've purely been discussing the conversations surrounding the introductions of these new characters since, for the most part, the actual content of the comics they appeared in wasn't anything too remarkable. But February of 2015 saw the release of Thor number 5, which contained a scene that really soured naysayers on the new iteration of the Norse deity. The sequence begins with Thor battling the villains Titania and the Absorbing Man in Times Square. The male antagonist begins spewing misogynistic language at our hero, a thinly veiled attempt to comment on the online backlash. "Thor? Are you kidding me? I'm supposed to call you Thor? Damn, feminists are ruining everything. You want to be a chick superhero? Fine, who the hell cares? But you get your own identity. Thor's a dude. One of the last manly dudes still left. What did you do? Send him to sensitivity training so he'd stop calling Earth girls wenches?" Although she doesn't say it out loud, Thor's inner monologue reveals that Aaron's thoughts were about the comments he was receiving. That's for saying feminists like it's a 4-letter word, creep. After Thor breaks Absorbing Man's jaw, Titania enters and finishes the job by knocking out her partner and surrendering. Her reasoning confused many readers. I ain't fighting no woman, Thor. And neither is he. Not today, at least. I'm standing down, out of respect for what you're doing. But just so you know, this is a one-time girl power pass. When he wrote the scene, Aaron probably viewed it as a moment of empowerment between two strong female characters. But the fanbase had a much different reaction. Critics argued that the interaction between hero and villain had the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than ingratiate the audience to this new take on the beloved character by showcasing her strength and courage, they instead showed her winning a fight because her opponent simply gave up. These few pages spread across the internet rapidly as detractors felt vindicated in their hatred of this new Thor. But what did the sales numbers say? While the figures expectedly dropped following the debut issue, Thor #1 was Marvel's second best-selling book in October 2014. While Captain America #25 didn't reach nearly the same heights, the following month's all-new Captain America #1 also launched up to the #2 spot of the sales charts. This was a result of a heavy marketing push from Marvel, who had chosen some interesting platforms to announce these changes. While Sam Wilson's new role was revealed by Stephen Colbert on The Colbert Report, Jane Foster becoming Thor was bizarrely unveiled by the ladies of The View. Unfortunately, the footage of both of these appearances have been wiped from the internet, but it spoke to the goals of Axel Alonso and Marvel Comics as a whole. These changes were designed to reach far beyond the already established comic reading audience. They wanted the world talking about these books, and for a little while, they got their wish. This all laid the foundation for Marvel's next big publishing initiative dubbed All New, All Different. Following the events of Comics Secret Wars in 2015, great story by the way, the Marvel Universe was reborn with a brand new set of characters pushed to the forefront. This was accompanied by an image of the stars of this era, but this barely scratched the surface of their plans. Upon the beginning of All New, All Different, or just ANAD for short, change began happening rapidly. A new Avengers team composed entirely of female characters was created, dubbed A-Force. Wolverine was killed and replaced with a woman. The Hulk was killed and replaced with a Korean teenager. Star-Lord of Guardians of the Galaxies was briefly replaced by a female character. Even Miles Morales was folded into the main Marvel continuity, although he and Peter Parker continue to simultaneously use the name Spider-Man. Interestingly, this new diverse wave seemed to only affect Marvel, as their competition over at DC were less willing to radically change up their character roster. The biggest thing they did was in 2015 when they revealed that Harley Quinn was in a polyamorous lesbian relationship with the Batman villain Poison Ivy. Although this was only mentioned in a tweet. It wasn't until 2017 that the two were actually seen kissing in a comic. And even then, artist Chad Hardin went to Twitter to reveal that the drawing that ended up being published had been edited from his original, more passionate intention. Also, many Gooner comic book fans seem to be more open to this style of LGBTQ representation. Back to Marvel, probably the most consequential of their new additions was Riri Williams, a black teenager who took over as the protagonist of the Invincible Iron Man series under the codename Ironheart, after Tony Stark fell into a coma. Riri was another creation of writer Brian Michael Bendis, who perhaps was trying to recapture the same success he had found with Miles Morales 5 years prior. His stated intention for both characters was similar, taking an established Marvel superhero and creating a fresh new spin on them. Similar to the criticism received by G. Willow Wilson when she created Kamala Khan, Bendis was subjected to a slew of backlash from people angry that a white man was spearheading this landmark book for diversity. But he defended himself by saying, "I'm the father of 4 children, 2 of whom are an African girl and an African American girl. I don't say that to throw my kids as a shield in front of any critique. I say that as, you see me as a white man, but actually I'm a Jewish man and have a multiracial family. I worry about the trap that means that African American people should only write African American characters and Asian Americans should only write Asian Americans. Everyone should write and draw everything. Everyone has a unique perspective and ability. Of course, those on the other side of the aisle had their own problems with the new Armored Avenger. Aside from the people criticizing her purely for her race and gender, one major talking point was that many readers simply found Ironheart too unlikable. The main example used to support this argument came from Invincible Iron Man number 8, which included a flashback scene of Riri in elementary school speaking with her teacher. "I wanted you to know I have decided what I will be when I grow up." Let's hear it. "I am going to be a scientist." That's great. No, you're supposed to say, "You mean like a nurse," and then I say, "Why would I say that?" You're supposed to tell me nursing and teaching are noble professions, and that people like me don't get to grow up and be scientists. Why would I do that? That's what they said to the first African-American female astronaut. And she told them, "No, I'm going to be a scientist," and then she did it. Yes, that was a long time ago. Things were different back then, but because of people like her, a girl like you can do whatever you want, fly anywhere you want, and be anyone you want. I was kind of hoping you'd tell me the opposite so I would have something to inspire me to prove you wrong. After more pushback from Riri, her teacher finally relents and decides at random to tell her that she will never be Tony Stark, setting the girl on a new path in life. People who hated the new character used this as the ultimate vindication for their opinion, since they believed she was being portrayed as someone who needed to victimize herself in order to function. Those on the other side argued that these critics didn't know what they wanted. When someone like Jane Foster Thor won a fight too easily, she was called a Mary Sue, but when someone like Riri Williams showed actual flaws, she was lambasted as a bad character. That being said, while she had her fans, Ironheart was not exactly the most beloved new addition to Marvel's canon. In fact, this was around the time that the harshest critics of this new age began to take shape. The YouTube channel Diversity in Comics, which has since been renamed Comics Matter, started uploading around April of 2017 with a series dubbed Marvel Before SJW, in which the owner discussed some of his favorite comics published long before the ANAD era. The low-effort nature of these videos, consisting simply of him pointing his phone camera at a comic book and talking unscripted, allowed him to pump out multiple uploads per day. Eventually, once he decided to branch into scathing reviews of the new comics, his views began to climb exponentially. Unfortunately, while we were working on this video, he privated a substantial chunk of his back catalog of videos, with no archives to be found, and so we've lost access to a lot of the clips we've planned to show here. While he was far from the first anti-SJW content creator on YouTube for comics, his style of quickly produced rant videos paired with sensationalist titles came at a time when this strategy was financially viable. The owner of this channel remained anonymous for most of his early career, merely going by the pseudonym Zach. While he was able to criticize pretty much every new comic published by Marvel due to the breakneck pace of his upload schedule, Riri Williams became a particularly strong focus for him early on.
Marvel, when they get a female hero, they can't show her fighting a villain or struggling or doing something heroic. She has to do the OMG, I'm famous or whatever, with a bunch of idiot airhead millennials screaming to have her get an autograph, to which she's, of course, someone's doing a selfie of her. And she has to have this stupid, fake modest face, OMG, autographs are a thing or whatever.
More than anyone else from the new crop of Marvel heroes, Zach became fixated on figuring out a way to fix Riri, ultimately coming to the conclusion that she would work much better as a villain. This culminated in a project dubbed Riri Birth, a fan comic which saw the young heroine's fall from grace. He published 2 short comics, Mark 15 and Defeated Iron Man, which he released for free and funded using his rapidly growing Patreon support. However, this was not the end of the Riri Birth story, as a YouTuber named VKTR Official created his own set of audio dramas set within that continuity. Zach was thrilled by this, shouting it out on his own channel, although the videos have all since been deleted. Even though Riri Birth eventually fizzled out, it proved 2 things. One, Zach had ambitions in comics beyond just talking about them on YouTube. And 2, he was able to rally a community behind him in a way Marvel's modern critics hadn't done. As the Diversity in Comics channel grew, more and more people decided to make their own videos in order to jump on the bandwagon. While it's difficult to find exactly when the name was created, this was the time when Comicsgate truly began to form as a movement with actual people leading the charge, rather than just a disorganized group of disgruntled fans on social media. Aside from Zach, the most noteworthy creator by far was under the name Comic Artist Pro Secrets. This was a channel created by professional artist Ethan Van Sciver, who had previously worked for DC Comics on titles such as Green Lantern, The Flash, and Batman. What originally started as a place for Ethan to upload drawing tutorials soon evolved into similar anti-SJW commentary as his contemporaries. And his hands-on experience working in the industry quickly made him one of the most sought-after voices. He even maintained his connections with his peers who disagreed with him politically during the beginning of his YouTube tenure. In November of 2017, Van Sciver interviewed beloved and prolific writer Mark Waid, who was working for Marvel at the time, about the current state of the company.
None of us, we're all working with the best of intentions. You don't have to like everything we do. You don't have to like anything some of us do. But everybody's working with the best intentions. No one, and I think you'll back me up on this, man, no one is deliberately making comics to piss you off.
I'm trying to make money.
Van Sciver had been no stranger to controversy prior to his rise to YouTube prominence, though. For years, comic book fans had criticized him for his edgy sense of humor and provocative imagery used in his work. For instance, he once released a sketchbook titled My Struggle, a winking reference to a certain Austrian painter's autobiography. Some critics even claim the signature he drew on the cover was meant to resemble a swastika. With this controversial reputation, it should come as no surprise that things eventually bled into real life. In November of 2017, Ethan attended a fan signing event at Gotham City Pizza in Orlando, Florida. While things seemed to go well enough, the next day he posted to Twitter that the restaurant had been vandalized during the night. While there were no witnesses and no suspect was ever caught, Van Sciver placed the blame squarely on the SJWs who had been attacking him over social media. As Comicsgate began to form into what it would eventually become, some people decided to come together to define what exactly they were fighting for. The administrators of the Comicsgate wiki eventually came up with 5 modern trends they wanted to do away with. 1. The adoption of art styles influenced exclusively by progressive politics. 2. The hiring of people based purely on their surface traits and oppressed demographic status. 3. The change or outright replacement of beloved classic characters in the interest of shallow appeasement, supposedly in the name of progress. 4. The elite attitude and purge of anything that is not progressive under the mantra of not progressive enough. And finally, 5. The rejection of honest criticism swept aside as harassment or discrimination. As these pro-Comicsgate influencers continued to grow, so did the comic book industry continue to give them ample material to discuss. Because yes, we've barely examined the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all the outrage-inducing comics Marvel published between 2015 and 2017. Up until this point, we've only talked about the replacement of established white male characters with women and minorities. But to be fair, the overall controversy went far deeper than just that. For instance, take All New X-Men number 40, written once again by our good friend Brian Michael Bendis. This issue contained a conversation between the characters Jean Grey and Bobby Drake, aka Iceman, 2 members of the original X-Men, which revealed that the latter had been gay all this time. Even people who weren't opposed to this change could agree that this moment was handled clumsily. Not only did the story come screeching to a halt for the scene to happen, but it wasn't even Iceman's decision to come out. Rather, Jean Grey used her ability to read minds in order to figure out the information for herself, and then pressured Bobby to admit it. Unlike with his other controversial changes to Marvel canon, it's difficult to find a solid explanation from Bendis as to why he made this decision. The closest he appeared to come was an interview with IGN in which he expressed a joy about his ability to, quote, change the conversation toward the end of his run on X-Men, seemingly a backhanded reference to the fact that his time on the book had been notoriously unpopular. This was far from the only provocative scene or moment from this era either. The fourth issue of the series, Angela, Queen of Hell, included a scene where the ancient Norse god Bor spewed forth a tirade which was comically censored with black boxes and text approximating what he was saying. These included phrases like, "a lot of misogynistic filth," "red pill MRA, meninist, casual racism," and the most widely mocked of all of them, "unsolicited opinions on Israel." That last one became a meme for a short period of time, as readers were left baffled why such an out-of-place line had been made in the book. Spider-Woman #1 from 2015 began a somewhat controversial saga in which the titular character fought crime while pregnant. Interestingly, the first issue of the prior run of Spider-Woman from the previous year also sparked outrage from the other side of the political spectrum, when one of the variant covers showed the protagonist in a position some argued was overly sexual. The artist Milo Manara was already well known for his erotic work and was set to also draw covers for 2 other upcoming Marvel books. Unfortunately, following the intense backlash for this Spider-Woman painting, the publisher opted to cancel these projects. On the subject of controversial covers, the final issue of the series Mockingbird depicted the title character wearing a t-shirt, which read, "Ask me about my feminist agenda." It goes without saying that this did not go over well with a large section of the comic reading public. The writer, Chelsea Kane, was bombarded with hate on social media, prompting her to go on a tirade about the backlash. "My ranting wasn't a plea for affirmation. Truly, I'm just done here. I'm amazed by the cruelty comics bring out in people." Soon afterward, Kane deleted her Twitter account. Axel Alonso, who had largely remained silent about most of the online furies surrounding his Marvel reign up until that point, felt the need to finally speak up in his writer's defense. "I stand with Kelsey Kane, condemn online harassment, and think the Marvel Universe and the industry benefits and grows from diverse creators and characters." Although the hate against Chelsea was not that she was a woman or a feminist, but rather that she incorporated a cringe line in the book. Previously, Alonso had been criticized for his response to the rise of Comicsgate. During a Comic-Con panel in 2016, he was quoted describing himself as the last thing from a social justice warrior, which only served to anger both sides of the spectrum. But despite his reluctance to speak too much about the onslaught of controversies, the Mockingbird incident seemed to be a topic he was willing to dive into. In fact, in an issue of The Amazing Spider-Man published the following year, Peter Parker was seen wearing the infamous t-shirt as a one-off joke. Chelsea Kane, on the other hand, was not so amused. Mockingbird had been her first time working with Marvel, and it also ended up being her last. While Mockingbird may have been one of the more controversial books during the Comicsgate era, there was another that stood out from the crowd as being particularly despised: America. Written by Gabby Rivera, this series followed newcomer superhero America Chavez, a gay Latina whose adventures saw her traveling across parallel universes. This book was a frequent target of diversity in comics, both for the obvious surface-level reasons as well as the plethora of questionable dialogue choices. Even as early as the first issue, the title character was using exclamations such as, "What in the holy menstruation?" But by far the most egregious example came from issue #5, in which the character Kate Bishop monologues to no one in particular about how incredible America and her girlfriend are together. I'm literally intrigued and in awe of both of them. If this is what it's like to date other women, then I applaud all the women dating women right now because this is incredible. Motorcycle courtship chase? Check. Missiles and explosions? Yup. And now we're just flying together in the sky heading to a giant heart? I swear, if they come back married, I'm going to be jealous. This is probably as good of a time as any to go over some of the preferred phrases used by prominent Comicsgate figures when discussing this era of Marvel. First of all, purse puppies refers to how they felt the books often treated their gay and minority characters like perfect trophies to show off, rather than writing them as realistic, three-dimensional people. Second, they would often describe America and other comics like it as comics for no one. Essentially, this was the term to describe the books that were created to appeal to a diverse new fan base, but often failed to meet that goal. While the legitimacy of this claim can be argued on an individual basis, America specifically did not seem to strike a chord with readers in the way Marvel had hoped. Issue number 1 didn't exactly top the charts. In spite of this, it managed to stick around for 12 issues, with the final installment crawling across the finish line by only selling a little over 6,000 copies nationwide. I feel like Chris Chan would sell more copies of a new edition of Sonichu. This is also a good opportunity to talk about the careers of the people behind these despised comics. Before Mockingbird, Chelsea Kane had never worked on a comic before, as she had previously made a career writing thriller novels. Gabby Rivera similarly did not have a background in comics, as Marvel had plucked her from the world of young adult fiction. Supporters of Comicsgate argued that these recent outsider hires had only been given jobs because of their gender, race, or sexual orientation, rather than any real qualifications. Of course, the vast majority of Marvel's writers were people who had been working in comics for years, but it didn't stop critics from saying most of the new diverse hires were people who didn't deserve the position they were given. And it was this specific point of ire that would create the biggest skirmish of Comicsgate yet. On July 23, 2017, Florence Steinberg, the former secretary of Stan Lee as well as a prolific comic publisher in her own rights, passed away. A few days later, on the 28th, a group of female Marvel staffers decided to go out for milkshakes in her honor. Heather Antos, who was an editor at the time, gathered everyone together for a selfie, which she then posted on social media with the caption, "It's the Marvel Milkshake Crew." For Antos and all the women featured in the image, this was nothing more than a fun little thing that they most likely expected to forget about minutes after uploading. But when supporters of Comicsgate saw this, things escalated in a way nobody could have predicted. These milkshakes definitely brought all the boys to the yard, as people who hated the current state of Marvel Comics descended on Antos. To them, this single image represented everything they had been criticizing for years at that point, and they certainly made their voices heard. Unfortunately, it's difficult now to gauge what the exact size of the blowback was since Antos has privated her Twitter account, and most of the articles from the time did not archive the negative responses. Even a particularly infamous tweet from Diversity in Comics in which he called the women fake geek girls has practically been lost to time, and finding a single screenshot took a lot of digging. But what we do know for certain is that the firestorm was so severe, industry professionals and fans alike decided to band together in defense of these women, creating a counter-movement dubbed Make Mine Milkshake, a play on the old company slogan Make Mine Marvel. Supporters across social media began posting selfies, drinking milkshakes, and reading the newer, diverse comics. Even the official Marvel Twitter account got in the action, uploading a panel from the series Young Avengers in which the character Hela drank a milkshake and said, quote, "Some people harbor the most terrible grudges." This event skyrocketed Comicsgate to the mainstream. Previously, it had just been scuffles between angry fans and individual creators that went largely ignored by the wider public. Now, though, the movement had made themselves heard, and the industry as a whole had taken a firm stance against everything the movement stood for. That being said, this doesn't exactly tell the full story of how Marvel was responding. A few months prior, Axel Alonso, alongside Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing David Gabriel, held a retailer summit to address the fear held by many comic book store owners at the time. The declining sales had been hurting them most of all, and many blamed the all-new, all-different characters for the financial strain they were in. There were plenty of anecdotes of potential customers entering their stores hoping to read comics featuring the superheroes they had seen in the widely popular Marvel Cinematic Universe films, only to leave empty-handed upon discovering the characters featured in the current books were completely different. Marvel was shockingly upfront about these problems, and one particular quote from Gabriel caught the attention of the public. What we heard was that people didn't want any more diversity. They didn't want female characters out there. That's what we heard, whether we believe that or not. I don't know that that's really true, but that's what we saw in sales. We saw the sales of any character that was diverse, any character that was new, our female characters, anything that was not a core Marvel character, people were turning their nose up against. That was difficult for us because we had a lot of fresh, new, exciting ideas that we were trying to get out, and nothing new really worked. Gabriel quickly clarified his statement here, assuring readers that Marvel would not be giving up on their new diverse characters. Nevertheless, it still courted backlash from onlookers who accused the comic publishing juggernaut of kowtowing to trolls and bigots. This would end up being one of the final nails in the coffin for Axel Alonso's career at Marvel. Not only had his time in office been marred with one controversy after the next, but the struggling sales numbers spoke for themselves. Just a few months later, in November, it was announced that he was out as editor-in-chief, replaced by C.B. Cebulski. While no reason was given for his exit, most people had some idea as to why this had happened. Just a year after Cebulski took charge of Marvel, the company launched a new initiative dubbed Fresh Start. This saw the grand return of the original Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, Wolverine, and all the other characters who had been replaced in the past few years. Even with Alonso gone and all the beloved classic characters returned, people liked diversity in comics, and Ethan Van Sciver continued their crusade. For them, just because one man had left Marvel, that didn't mean the perceived cancer was gone. And those in the industry were growing more and more frustrated with the growth of Comicsgate. In August of 2018, a Twitter user posted a since-deleted clip of fan-favorite writer and artist Darwyn Cooke, who had passed away a couple years prior, speaking at a convention about how he didn't enjoy established characters being turned gay to boost sales. This was used as proof that the departed creator would have been a supporter of Comicsgate. But when his widow Marcia saw this tweet, she disagreed. "Hi guys, this is Darwyn's wife, and I can guarantee he thought you Comicsgate idiots were a bunch of crybaby losers ruining comics. Because you are." Supporters of Comicsgate began going after Marcia for this comment, to which she continued to double down and clarify what her husband had actually meant. Ethan Van Sciver soon stepped in, attempting to clear the air and not let the situation get out of control. "I hate Twitter, Marcia. Everyone loved Darwyn and likes to project themselves onto him now that he's gone. He's terribly missed by all. As for who he was and what he believed, nobody knew him like you did. And nobody will truly know how he felt about things like you do. Period." Marcia soon replied to Van Sciver, asking if he would tell people to apologize for harassing her. While he did do as she asked, it wasn't exactly what she had meant. Yes, SJWs in comics apologized to Marcia Cooke for cynically using her as a shield to attack Comicsgate, and for lying to her. This prompted a number of industry creatives to tweet in support of Marcia, denouncing Comicsgate and everything it stood for. Writer Tom Taylor, who had previously been behind the female Wolverine reboot, tweeted the phrase, "I believe comics are for everyone. There is no excuse for harassment. There is no place for homophobia, transphobia, racism, or misogyny in comics criticism." These words ended up being copied and pasted onto the Twitter feeds of many of Taylor's peers, becoming something of an anti-Comicsgate mantra. While this was embraced by fans at large, there were some who criticized the fact that people only spoke up against harassment when white women were being attacked. Even Marcia Cooke herself agreed with that sentiment. But the comic book industry, all publicly and vocally standing together against Comicsgate, did nothing to slow it down. In fact, it may have served to amplify it. In 2018, Diversity in Comics produced a video that will live in infamy known simply as The Dark Roast. Over the past couple years, Zack had made countless public comments going after the people he felt were ruining Marvel and the comic book industry as a whole, but he always tried to show some kind of decorum by watching the specific language he used. The Dark Roast, on the other hand, was a private video intended to be seen only by his most loyal supporters, in which Zack allowed himself to truly let loose. Of course, the rant eventually leaked to the public, and what he had to say continues to shock people even all these years later.
So the Dark Roast is the stuff where I get to say stuff like, Dan Slott looks like a pedophile. And I don't have to dance around. I don't have to say parody or wink wink. I'm like, seriously, he looks like a pedophile. But all SJW writers look like pedophiles. The only real difference is, does it look like they're into little boys or little girls? Dan Slott, I'd say little girls. Mark Waid, probably little girls. Brian Bendis, probably like a switch hitter. You know, it has to suit his fancy for the day.
Across the 20-minute diatribe, Zach tore apart anyone and everyone who had ever irritated him. Among the more infamous of his statements was an accusation that Mark Waid used his position of power in the industry to attract women.
Mark Waid is also a creeper. The guy frickin' used he used DC as a frickin' OkCupid. Devin Grayson literally like sucked her way into the comic industry. Usually you get out of the industry because you suck. She got into it from sucking. So don't you know, here comes bald, short, homely Mark Waid punching down, or maybe fisting down. All of a sudden he's dating her. It was like, she was like 22, he was like pushing 40. So he's a creeper. I've had pros tell me like he's in for it because basically his whole life, dude frickin' left his wife so he can go frickin' hit on cosplay girls. It's frickin' ridiculous. The dude's like 55 with the frickin' emotional continence of frickin' a 2-year-old.
Zach also accused many of his critics of running sock puppet accounts to make the backlash against them seem more severe than it was. On top of that, he dubbed prominent trans writer Mags Visaggio a trans trender, and used some very particular language to describe a comics journalist by the name of Matt Santori Giffith.
I actually went to go hesitate myself, and then I realized that I'm on the dark roast. He's a fag. I'm still going to make a little caveat. I think the gay people listening know what I mean, because I live in a gay neighborhood. There's a difference between a gay man and a fucking fag. Matt Santori Griffith is a fucking fag. He's just this like flouncing, like super dramatic, everything's rape, everything's harassment, everything's bigotry.
As if that all wasn't a bad enough look, Zach saved his harshest words for Heather Antos and the other so-called milkshake girls.
Heather Antos is a cum dumpster who got a job at Marvel because Jordan, what's his name? Jordan White. So the story is that she went and saw him at a convention. It's like, I'd like to be an editor. And he's like, oh, this is going to be a hard sell for HR. Like Jordan White's going to go to Marvel HR. I really need you to hire her. My spank bank is getting incredibly low. Spank bank is the mental image you have of women when you off to them. Funny thing is that I saw a couple of the milkshake girls, and it was very, very, very odd. The milkshake girls were all of a sudden like 80% of the associate editors were female, and none of them had any experience. They are literally just work girlfriends for these creepy middle-aged or approaching middle-aged white guys who can't get any girl to talk. The funny thing is, people are like, oh, is there a lot of, you think there's going to be like a Hollywood, like bunch of sexual harassment suits and Marvel? Like, no, these guys are cucks. Like, literally talking to them, they're jizzing in their pants. Like, they just want a girl around. Oh my God, Heather just DM'd me and she said, LOL. And this is just off for like 5 hours.
These are just some of the examples of what was said, and it's not an exaggeration to point out that Zach truly went scorched earth on all his enemies. His words here have followed him for years and only served to paint a bigger target on his back from industry pros who already had ample reason to hate him. Even some of his supporters found it to be over the line. Following the viral spread of the Dark Roast, even more mainstream outlets began taking notice of Comicsgate. While most chose to report on Zach's vitriol from a distance, comedian Jim Jeffries decided to reach out to Diversity in Comics directly in order to interview him for his Comedy Central show. This was the first time the anonymous YouTuber showed his face publicly, and his real name was revealed to be Richard.
There's an actual backlash against diversity in comic books. And the movement is led by a supervillain. He runs a YouTube channel, broadcast from his secret lair / bedroom closet.
Of course, Jim took the opportunity to confront Richard over his comments in the Dark Roast.
You called a woman a dumpster.
Yeah.
That's not good.
Yeah, it was a bad idea.
Overall, this didn't end up being the brutal teardown Jeffries probably expected it to be. In fairness, it's difficult to get into the minutia of a debate like this in a 7-minute TV segment. But the fact that the host himself admitted he was not an active reader of comics did not set him off on the right foot as an authority on the subject. He did assemble a panel of diverse superhero fans to argue against Richard's ideology, but they too did not have enough time to get much deeper than the surface level. It also didn't help that there were multiple instances of Jeffries obviously editing Richard to make him seem as bad as possible.
Okay, so how do you feel about this black Superman? Okay, a slightly less black Superman.
Yeah, no, that's actually better.
Ironically, Jim's video may have had the opposite of its intended effect. While the harshness of the dark roast had alienated some of the YouTuber's fanbase, the comedian's lackluster takedown attempt reunited them once again around a common enemy. And the YouTube upload of the segment currently sits at roughly a 70% dislike ratio. In spite of the best efforts of their detractors, Comicsgate's influence only continued to grow across 2018. In fact, it was undoubtedly the most important year for the movement. It was during this time that the ringleaders decided to leverage their ever-expanding audience to increase their ambitions. They wouldn't just be talking about comic books anymore, they would start making their own. In June, Ethan Van Sciver announced that he was quitting DC Comics and launched an Indiegogo campaign to fund a reboot of his creator-owned series from the 90s, Cyberfrog. This was a rousing success, raising significantly more than its initial $8,000 goal. This momentous achievement led to several other comic book professionals who were similarly dissatisfied with the state of the industry reaching out to Ethan in order to collaborate. On September 2nd, it was announced that Dave Sim, creator of the popular indie comic Cerebus, would be writing an upcoming Cyberfrog story. Similar to Van Sciver, Sim was also a very controversial figure in the world of comics, with his hardline stance against feminism earning him scorn from peers. This of course only made him more appealing to supporters of Comicsgate, and they largely ignored any outcry against his hiring. But there was one criticism they couldn't turn a blind eye to. Later in 2018, Van Sciver published a video decrying gay shipping culture in the Star Wars fandom in which he likened it to grooming. This caught the attention of Twitter user RenFamous, who accused the comic book creator of hypocrisy. She posted a screenshot of Dave Sim admitting to having sex with a 21-year-old girl who he had originally met when she was just 14. Detractors argue that if fans simply drawing two fictional characters in a homosexual relationship qualified as child grooming, surely this did as well. Ethan, for his part, initially downplayed the seriousness of Sim's admission, comparing it to the age gap of Elvis and Priscilla Presley, a famous couple known to have a very functional relationship. Eventually, though, he was forced to concede and announce that Sim had been removed from the project. But Ethan was far from the only person disgruntled with the industry who was making his own comic. In fact, it was also during this time that he started Comicsgate Live, a series of streams which provided a platform for independent creators to promote their own projects. But there were other people outside his audience who had ambitions of their own. In September, a creator known as Vox Day, who was also very vocal in the surrounding conversation and had already been releasing his own works for some time, announced a new publishing imprint with a name that caused a great deal of backlash, Comicsgate. People were outraged that someone would take the name of a communal movement and turn it into a personal brand. Vox Day didn't seem to think he had done anything wrong, though, as he expressed in an interview with Bounding Into Comics when they asked him if he saw his new imprint as associated with the movement. It depends upon who you mean by Comicsgate. If you mean rejecting the core 5 points, then we are very clearly Comicsgate. If you mean something that is SJW inclusive, intrinsically opposed to identity politics, and owned by Ethan Van Sciver, then we very clearly are not. This represented a small but growing distaste for the trend Ethan Van Sciver had started off using Comicsgate to fund personal projects. Although for the time being, Vox Day's opinions remained fairly niche as the larger conversation was overtaken by another comic being created by a friend of Ethan's. The creator of Diversity in Comics, Richard, announced his own project, Jawbreaker's Lost Souls, which was a great success on Indiegogo. After the campaign concluded, it was announced that the book would be released through independent publisher Antarctic Press. This caused a large stir in the comic book community, with fans asking their local stores not to sell Jawbreakers or any other Antarctic book until they ended their deal with Richard. In response, a number of retailers on Facebook discussed their plans to boycott the comic, which the creator quickly caught wind of and posted a screenshot of to Twitter. Keep in mind that the censoring in this image was done by the article which archived the story, and Richard's post showed the names of all involved. And this was far from the end of the crusade, as he allegedly posted the information of multiple other stores that publicly refused to sell Jawbreakers, leading to all of them receiving a slew of threatening messages, although it's important to note he denies that specific claim and I can't find any solid evidence to back it up. This behavior was seen to many in the industry as wildly unprofessional. This was what prompted Mark Waid to enter the picture, posting on Facebook that he was attempting to get in contact with Antarctic Press to sternly discuss the situation. It wasn't long before Antarctic was forced to make a statement announcing that they would no longer be publishing Jawbreakers. People who supported the campaign on Indiegogo were furious, looking every which way for someone to pin the blame on. The obvious choice was Mark Waid, since he had made such a large public statement about speaking to the publisher, and Richard was happy to feed into that fervor. The vicious intimidation by Mark Waid yesterday was far beyond the realm of decency. Intimidation, threats, coercion against a publisher, a medical professional, and a good man brought to his ragged edge in just 2 days from the pressure. Disgusting. What was his evidence for this supposed vicious intimidation, you might ask? A screenshot of a second-hand retelling of a post from 4chan about how Waid had apparently used Marvel's name to lord power over Antarctic Press, prompting the indie publisher to threaten legal action against the comics juggernaut. Even the writer of this accusation told readers to take it with a grain of salt, and Antarctic quickly stepped in to clarify that their communication with Waid had been cordial and legal action was never considered. But even so, the war between Richard and Waid had officially begun. On September 19, 2018, Diversity in Comic filed a lawsuit against Mark Waid for tortious interference with contract and defamation. He doubled down on the accusation that Waid had threatened Antarctic into dropping Jawbreakers and claimed that the prolific writer had effectively blackballed Richard from the comic industry. Waid quickly hired a lawyer named Mark Zaid, who, despite what his name may imply, was not just Mark Waid representing himself while wearing a fake novelty mustache. He also started a GoFundMe campaign for his defense which, thanks to the support of his peers in the comic book industry, managed to raise over $81,000. In response, Ethan Van Sciver decided to launch a rival GoFundMe on Richard's behalf, collecting $146,000. The description of this campaign showed just how much Ethan's opinion of Mark had changed since they talked on a live stream only a year prior. Mark Waid, a bully with a history of harassing those who disagree with him, took it upon himself to call Zack's publisher and interfere with the contract they had between them. He is at the very heart of the problem in comics. And we must not allow Richard's limited resources to be the reason why he isn't stopped. As is the case with many court proceedings, neither party discussed the case much publicly during its 2-year arbitration. It wasn't until December of 2020 that they released a joint statement saying that Richard had voluntarily decided to dismiss the suit, with neither side admitting wrongdoing. It may feel a bit anticlimactic for a story with such a bombastic opening to end so quietly, but such is often the case when conflicts go from social media to the courtroom. As for Jawbreakers, Richard ultimately decided to self-publish it under his own label, Splato Comics, through which he had released multiple other crowdfunded books over the following years. At this point, it may seem that the era of Comicsgate rallying together against a comic they hated was a thing of the past. And for the most part, it was. People like Diversity in Comics and Van Sciver continued criticizing newer releases, but there really wasn't anything like Ironheart or America coming out anymore that they could rally their fans behind in hatred. That changed in March of 2020 when Marvel announced a new series that almost served as a last hurrah for everything Comicsgate stood against. The release in question was a 30th anniversary celebration of the 1990 series, The New Warriors, featuring a brand new team consisting of original and diverse superheroes. But there were some additions that people took great issue with. First off, there was Screen Time, who the press described as a meme-obsessed super teen whose brain became connected to the internet after becoming exposed to his grandfather's experimental internet gas. They didn't explain what exactly internet gas was, and we may never know. Courting much more controversy, however, were the twin heroes Snowflake and Safespace, the former of whom was non-binary. Writer Daniel Kibblesmith explained that he had chosen those names because he wanted to reclaim these words that were widely seen to have a derogatory context. The response, while predictably negative, was far greater than anyone expected. Not only did Comicsgate hate it, but so too did the people who normally celebrated Marvel's efforts at representation. The main point of contention on the other end was that Daniel Kibblesmith, a cisgender man, shouldn't be deciding how to reclaim hurtful language for non-binary people.
The character designs of these characters, the names of these characters, they do not seem like they're here in earnest. They don't seem like these are a push for nice, genuine diversity, which I am all for. I think it's high time that we got some legitimate non-binary representation in comic books. But this does not seem like this is gonna be it.
Not only that, but the image of the twins shown on the cover seemed to depict them more as a romantic couple than siblings. The controversy got so large that even people like Joe Rogan were talking about it. The trailer for the comic on Marvel's YouTube channel was universally disliked, and the company fell silent on the future of the series. But in the midst of the havoc of COVID-19, publishers across the industry were forced to cancel a number of upcoming books. For Marvel, this included The New Warriors, which was quietly removed from their release schedule with no comment given as to why. But that wasn't quite the end of the story. In July of 2024, an anonymous Marvel insider leaked the unreleased first issue of the hated series to a few Comicsgate creators, including Richard. While these YouTubers were instructed not to reveal the entire comic, they did make videos going over a few pages. And that was pretty much the last great controversy for Marvel Comics when it came to diversity. But that begs the question, what became of everyone who got caught up in the whirlwind? Well, Heather Antos left Marvel in March of 2018 to become editor-in-chief at an esports betting website called Unicorn. The site has since shut down after charges were filed against them by the SEC for selling an unregistered token called Unicoin Gold. Antos now works as a freelance editor. Brian Michael Bendis, on the other hand, is still very successful in the world of mainstream comics. Most recently, it was announced that several of his independent projects were being developed into TV shows by Amazon. Similarly, people like G. Willow Wilson, Jason Aaron, and Tom Taylor continue to find consistent work in the space. Mark Waid is currently writing for DC, although the events of the last few years certainly seem to have taken a toll on his mental health. Most recently, he expressed his hopelessness on the state of the world following the results of the 2024 election. Even if by some miracle this turns around, I don't believe in the basic goodness of my fellow Americans anymore, and without this, I cannot write superheroes. There's no point. When you see a decline in the quality of my work soon, you'll be able to trace it back to this night. As for the likes of Gabby Rivera and Chelsea Kane, they haven't done any work for the two big comic publishers since the end of America and Mockingbird, respectively. After Axel Alonso left, he started his own company called Artists, Writers, and Artisans, or AWA for short, through which he continues to release the work of independent creators to this day. But what about the characters that these writers helped create that started the Comicsgate movement in the first place? Well, some like Carol Danvers, Miles Morales, and Kamala Khan have all continued to be featured heavily in Marvel stories, others have stepped back from the spotlight. At least that's the case in the comics. Over the past few years, more and more of these so-called SJW characters have begun to pop up in big-budget films. In fact, it's pretty much all of them. Miles, Carol, Kamala, Sam Wilson's Captain America, Jane Foster's Thor, Riri Williams, and even America Chavez have been adapted. At the same time, box office profits for Marvel's latest movies have taken a notable decline. Are these two facts connected? Well, there are certainly some people I can think of who would say yes. Which brings us to the current status of Comicsgate. While the movement still exists online, its reach and influence is nowhere near what it was just a few years prior. There were a couple more controversies in 2021, interestingly enough revolving around DC rather than Marvel. It was that year that the company received some flack when they revealed that both Tim Drake, the third Robin, and John Kent, son of Superman, were bisexual. Not only that, but when writer and artist Ed Piskor was accused of inappropriately messaging an underage girl in 2024, Ethan Van Sciver was quick to throw himself into the narrative, publicly celebrating the downfall of a comic book pro who he believes stood against Comicsgate. However, when Piskor tragically decided to take his own life, Van Sciver took a hard pivot to denouncing the SJW bullies who drove the man to such a dark place. Even so, Comicsgate itself was only a small aspect for most of those controversies, and that mostly came down to the former ringleaders losing their grip on the conversation. Ethan has drawn the ire of many of his former supporters for trying to push them out of the community. While he claimed these were people whose views were too extreme, detractors claim that he was just trying to cancel those that were making comics that competed with his own.
Ethan actually went out and then was called out on it. He was put, said, this is so tacky, a kill count for the people that he's canceled. So he's proud of it. He knows he's canceled people. He knows he's done it. And he it's not really effective anymore.
On top of that, Ethan has also been criticized for being incredibly slow to release his own crowdfunded book, and has been accused of drug and alcohol abuse, although those are admittedly mainly just memes from people who dislike him. But that reflects the much larger reason for why Comicsgate fell apart. People became resentful when they saw the leader of the movement's goals shift from changing the mainstream to promoting his own pet projects, whether you think the response was justified or not. Diversity in Comics is in a similar boat, maintaining a steady content stream on YouTube and crowdfunding books on Indiegogo. But judging from some of his recent videos, as well as deleting his old uploads, it seems like he has a bit of remorse for the cultural circle jerk he helped to cultivate. In conclusion, as long as there is a comic book industry, there will always be fans angry about changes being made to their favorite characters. But for a brief period of time, the stars aligned so as to focus that rage into a force that truly made its voice heard. To its supporters, it was a movement for change that fought back against the wokeness in superhero stories. To its detractors, it only served to make the comic book fandom significantly more toxic. And while Comicsgate itself no longer holds the same grasp on the culture, its impact will likely continue to be felt for years to come.